I read 27 graphic novels in 2024, so I thought I'd give you my top 5 from that bunch. Starting with number 5, we have Scarlet Traces Volume 1 from 2017. Now, as you might guess from the cover, this has something to do with War of the Worlds. It begins by just giving us a fairly straightforward reenactment of the novel War of the Worlds in comic book form. But then it moves on to a sequel where everybody's wondering if the Martians are going to come back. We may have defeated them, or rather our germs may have defeated them. I'm sure you know the War of the Worlds story. Everybody does at this point. They were defeated by bacteria, essentially. But they might return. And look what they've left behind, all this fancy Martian technology. So this is all about us making use of Martian technology that has been left behind, which is of course exactly what would have happened, but I've never seen another sequel to War of the Worlds go down that road, because the Martian war machines were all just standing there dead, waiting for us to tinker with them, weren't they? So that's a really good idea, and it made for a really fun graphic novel. In number 4, I've put Young Death, Boyhood of a Superfiend, which was originally published in 2000 AD, issue by issue in the 1990s, the year 1990 I believe, and it's now collected in 2008 in this graphic novel form. So Judge Death you will know of if you're familiar with Judge Dredd. So this is Mega City 1 of the future, and Judge Death is one of the villains that crops up every now and again. He belongs in a place called Dead World in another dimension, and this is his origin story, and it's told very much like the way Interview with the Vampire was done. He decides to allow a human to interview him, and he tells his story of how he became the way he became. So it turns out that Dead World wasn't always Dead World. It was a world very much like our own, and Judge Death was originally a character called, I forget the name, doesn't matter. He was basically a young boy who was ugly and psychopathic. So didn't have a lot going for him really, and he liked to torture animals and stuff. And eventually he became a trainee judge, where he started judging people very harshly. He started making his own philosophy, which was like, well, since if you want to get rid of crime, just get rid of the criminals and then there'll be no crime. So he started killing a lot more people than he should have in his role as a judge. And then he decided that since all crime is committed by the living, life itself must be a crime. But of course, part of the problem is he's alive. So we meet the Sisters of Death, and if you've ever read the Necropolis graphic novel, you'll know who they are. We meet them here, and we learn basically what happened to him, what turned him into Judge Death. It's a pretty fun origin story, and we meet his pals, Judge Fire, Judge Mortis, and Judge Fear. There were other trainee judges along with him who sympathized with his philosophy, and so on. Yeah, it's a fun read if you like Judge Dredd. In the number 3 place is Vampirella, The Essential Warren Years, published in 2008 in this form, but it dates way back to, I think, the 1960s, when there was a Vampirella magazine that came out month by month. It was essentially a comic book magazine, but intended for adult readers, because the pictures could be a little saucy here and there, as you can probably tell by Vampirella's costume. I got a whole bunch of Vampirella graphic novels on a humble bundle, and I really find it a lot of fun to read these stories. It's an intellectual property that is owned by the company Dynamite today, and they've produced a lot of modern material with Vampirella. I've read a lot of that stuff, but my favorite remains the original Vampirella comic strip from those original issues of the magazine. And a lot of it is collected here. And I think this is volume 1. I don't know if they ever brought out a volume 2, but there's a lot in this. It's quite a large volume, and there's quite a big story in here. I think it's the best Vampirella story. Her origins have been retold over and over in different incarnations by Dynamite, but the origin one here from the original is the best. So she's a vampire who comes from the planet Draculon, where rivers flow red with blood, and her planet is suffering a drought, and she decided to come to Earth. So she can walk in the daylight, and she has the vampire bloodlust like you would expect, but she's able to keep things in check with this blood serum developed by a couple of her pals, the Van Helsings. So we have Conrad Van Helsing, who is, I think, the son of Abraham Van Helsing from the Dracula novel, and his son is Adam Van Helsing. And there's another character who's an old stage magician called Pendragon. And these three are basically Vampirella's pals, and the four of them have various adventures together. And she's usually running around just in her little bikini, as you see, because that's the way people dress on Draculon. They don't have regular clothes like us. At least that's the excuse made for showing her in this fashion. They're good fun. They're never really too sexy, so there's nothing to worry about. Although it was probably considered quite edgy in the 1960s, it's really not now. And yeah, I thought these were fun stories, and I'm very likely to read this volume again. So that was number 3. In number 2, we have 40 Years of Scream, which came out in 2024, but was originally published in, I think, 1984. It was originally a 15-issue comic that I can remember buying issue 1 of. I don't think I collected them all, but I did buy issue 1. And I got to see them all in recent years because one of my friends found them in his attic and I got to read them. But the fact that this was able to be brought out as a graphic novel, big, massive, hardcover, coffee table sized graphic novel that collects everything in those 15 issues except for the letters pages. They decided to leave those out. All the front covers are there, everything's there, and the covers are in color, whereas the internals are in black and white mostly. It shows you how well remembered this is, the fact that you can publish this today, even though it only lasted 15 issues. I remember looking up some years ago on eBay, and you would pay quite a bit of money to try and get these issues. It contains stories. There's a modern adaptation of Dracula in here. There's a really good one called The 13th Floor, which is about a computer that takes over a tower block and tries to look after its residents. It's kind of an intelligent computer that has a bit of a dark side. And there's various other stories in here. All great fun. Lovely sort of well-drawn black and white artwork. And there's about 400 pages in here to read. It's really expensive to buy. It's about £50. It's brought out by Rebellion. I opted for the cheaper ebook option, which was only £10 because I'm a cheapskate. But it is a beautiful book. Similar to that one, in my number 1 spot is Misty, 45 Years of Fear, which came out the year before in 2023, also released by Rebellion. Misty is another old British comic. It dates from 1978 and it ran for about 100 issues, and it was a horror comic for girls. I was a little young at the time to remember it. My comic reading was The Eagle and 2000 AD, and that's what was marketed for boys. Things with, rocket ships and war and space battles and all kinds of things like that. Whereas for girls, there was more domestic type stories that were set in the present day. But it is curious that it was horror themed for girls. It says it's a mystery comic, but they really are horror stories. They're proper horror stories. This volume opens with a multi-part story called Moonchild, which is essentially a slightly toned down reproduction of Stephen King's Carrie. And Pat Mills, who wrote it, has even admitted that. It's essentially the story of Carrie with some changes along the way and a British feel to it, but it's Carrie. There's another one called The Sentinels, which is about 2 big tower blocks side by side, and people nickname these blocks the Sentinels. One of them no one can live in because people have disappeared there. And it turns out that the reason they've disappeared is because they're going into an alternate reality where it's a kind of totalitarian state. The Sentinels are still there, but you're in a different world, which is like a modern Nazi Germany. So what are we looking at? We're looking at Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, essentially, aren't we? Yeah. So there was a bit of copycat going on. It doesn't stop these being fun. I got a few Misty graphic novels. They came as part of a humble bundle that was called Treasury of British Comics. So I got all kinds of vintage comics. And when I read Misty, I just fell in love with this format and these kinds of stories. I mean, saying it's for girls is a bit like saying Carrie is just for girls. It just doesn't make sense. As an adult reader, I find this kind of thing much more interesting than the sort of war and sci-fi fare that was marketed for boys. Yeah. So Misty, I think, is even better than Scream. I was able to track down actually all issues of the comic online. But I do believe in supporting these reprints, so I bought the ebook of this. And just like the Scream one, this is available as a big coffee table sized hardcover, which you can get from Rebellion. So those are my top 5 graphic novels of 2024. See ya!